Righty. Okay, so we just have a few minutes together. So, Iran, one of the things that impresses me so much about you is that you are a poet and a pediatrician. And that to me is like, using both sides of your brain. So I'm just curious. I'm going to start with just asking, how does being a poet inform your practice as a pediatrician?
It's a great question. I think in a couple of different ways. Number one, being a poet is all about attentiveness to language. And one of the coolest parts of my job is getting to meet people and talk to people who speak and think all different ways for me. And people speak in the most poetic ways when we think about kind of the metaphors and similes that folks use to describe their experiences. And I think being a poet makes me more attuned to that and a little bit better able to communicate across cultural or linguistic differences. And then the other thing is that I think being a poet is really fundamentally for me about a very kind of deep observation and exploration of both myself and the world around me. And so as a result, as you heard in the poem that I read, I'm often thinking about these kind of big picture, very upstream historical, political, economic forces that impact my patients' lives, and spending time really sitting quietly and examining, how these systems look, my own complicity or my family's complicity, or what has created the world as we know it, is I think really helpful in bringing a level and a view of compassion to my patients, and a viewpoint that is what we call trauma informed. So instead of thinking, what's wrong with this person, why are they acting this way, as Juanica said, shifting that viewpoint to what happened here, what's going on in this person's life, and how can we move from that to a place of better communication or a place of healing.
That's so awesome, that notion of trauma informed care. And it kind of answers the second question a little bit, but I wonder if you have something else you'd share if I were to switch the question and say, how does being a pediatrician inform your being a poet?
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like there's an intersection there that you may have already spoken to, but
Yeah, it's definitely a bilateral relationship. I will say that I pretty much don't ever write directly about my patients. Even when I could anonymize things and avoid any sort of confidentiality issues, I don't find it particularly interesting or compelling, because a lot of times I'm not interested in writing someone else's story with my words. I'm more interested in writing my own perception of things, which feels a little more authentic. And so, if anything, I would say it kind of goes back to that piece I was saying earlier, that, having that kind of front row view and being privy to what really goes on in people's lives really impacts the way that I look at policy, or the way I look at, what's going on in the world, and the way that I think about history, because it becomes very personal when it's happening to my patients, or I can trace it back to what's happened to my patients. And that kind of, I think, lends a level of urgency to many of the things I write about in my poems, even if I'm not always writing about things that I've personally experienced, or maybe I'm writing about a different time period or something that happened in a different country. But having that connection, at least through my patients, allows me to inhabit that with a little more compassion.
Yeah, thank you. I'm hearing you say that your curiosity lends to your empathy and compassion. And I'm going to jump into the chat really quickly and ask a question from Christine Hollins, where she says, are there local organizations doing some good work in connection with in connecting youth with different backgrounds to share their stories with each other to strengthen their capacity for empathy? So are you aware of community action for children, for youth?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are some organizations that are doing this. So I know the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center has a variety of programming, some of which is youth centered. The organization that I work with, Creciendo Juntos, has several programs that are specifically directed toward youth and involve bringing adolescents together to do programming around arts and literature. And then I'm also an instructor for a new program through New City Arts, which is a gallery downtown. And we do youth workshops with local adolescents and high school students. And so that's really one of our hopes with that, is to really not only hone these kids' skills with poetry and writing, but also to give them a chance to connect with one another. I know there's the Writers House here in town. I can't say I'm very well versed with all their programming, but I believe they do offer some writing for youth and some youth-based programming. And then there's also Young Writers Workshop, which is a summer workshop. I believe it's residential down at Sweetbriar College. And that's a really great opportunity for anyone who's looking to kind of connect their child with a larger group of youth, both from a standpoint of craft writing skill, but also just to kind of share stories. That's what I'm sure there's more.
Yeah, that's a great list. I hope people were taking notes. I'm curious. That brings up my curiosity about what inspired you to launch into your poetry.
Yeah, so I've been writing ever since I can remember, which sounds really cliche, but when I was a really little kid, before I knew how to write, I would tell my mom that I had something to say and make her write things down for me. Um, and when I was younger, I really kind of dabbled in different genres, from short stories to what I called novels, which were like 10-page stories when I was 8, to poems. And I think poetry became a little more compelling for me as I got older, because with the rigor of my career, it's really hard to sometimes sit down and commit to a longer work. Whereas just taking 30 minutes to write a half a page of poetry felt more reasonable. And I think also poetry is for me, an almost sort of mystical experience, which makes it completely different from what I do in my everyday life. And of course, there's craft in poetry, and you can get formulaic and granular with poetry or with prose or any type of writing. But as somebody who is not formally trained in poetry, I've always experienced it as kind of an almost mystical experience and a purely creative experience. And so I think it became a really nice contrast going through a very evidence-based, scientific, rigorous medical education to kind of keep that part of my brain alive as well.
That is so wonderful. Here's a question from Millie Winstead. As a pediatrician, what do you believe will be the most impactful outcomes of this past year, both good and bad, on the mental health of our children?
Oh, this is something that I think about every day. I just kind of got goosebumps hearing that question because it's really, really concerning. I'm seeing a lot of mental health issues in kids, whether it's underlying depression and anxiety that's flaring up because kids don't have the structure of school, maybe the social support of their friends. I'm seeing kids who live in unsafe home environments, or just home environments that aren't particularly pleasant. Maybe there's a lot of fighting or limited resources, and that stress on top of everything else is really impacting their mental health. I'm also seeing really concerning things with education. I think that online school seems to be the safest thing right now, particularly going into the winter. But I am seeing the negative effects of that, which is that kids, again, are lacking the social supports. And I think just the educational benefit of being in person with their peers and with a teacher, which you just cannot replicate on Zoom. And I can't tell you the number of kids that I've seen whose grades have dropped, whose attention span has decreased, and who are really suffering, I think, educationally. So I'm very concerned about the mental health of kids as a result of all this. I'm trying to think of positive outcomes, I suppose, and this is going to deepen inequities, but I suppose for the kids who do have stable home environments, parents who have resources, who are able to kind of help them work through school, perhaps this could be a bonding opportunity for their siblings and their families. But again, I think that only applies to the very well-resourced families that I see who are able to manage all of that, and that's definitely a minority. So I think the mental health issues that we see for probably years, if not generations of this reverberating, is going to be really significant. And then not to mention the grief. So many kids have lost a grandparent, a parent, a great aunt or uncle, somebody in their family or in their community. And so when we think about that compound grief, again, it's just another sort of trauma that I think is going to have long-term impacts.
Thank you. I think we've got several questions in the chat. I'm just going to grab one more. And there's a request for you to do a reprise of your poem that you shared with us earlier. So Warren Buford says, love your comment about having hope in our youth. Thank you. Would love your thoughts on how we do better to empower young people and find ways to engage and listen to them so they become more a part of the conversation and the solutions we seek.
Sure. So I think a lot about the poet June Jordan, who many people don't know also was a children's book author. And I've been thinking about this with respect to my own children's book that I'm writing right now. And she talked about really the seriousness of childhood and the idea that as a culture and as a society, we kind of think of kids as foolish or immature and they don't know anything because they're little. And she talks about how we really need to take kids seriously. We need to take their questions seriously. And if we don't have an answer, we need to find an answer or change the situation so that it is just or it is reasonable. And she talks about this with respect to children's literature as well. You know, when we are creating content for kids, whether it's literature, programming, television, whatever that content might be, educational content, I think we need to approach it with that kind of seriousness. And I'm not implying that people don't already. This is kind of a new terrain for me as someone who's creating content for children. But I really appreciated that because I think society can make us feel like that's frivolous or that it's unserious when actually educating children, however we do that, whether it's as a parent, as a teacher, as a program creator, as a leader of a day camp, it is a very, very serious endeavor. And it's something that we need to think about the intergenerational implications of how we're teaching children, and not just providing them with answers, but how we're teaching them to ask questions and how we're kind of giving them the space and the voice to ask those questions. So I think it can look a little bit different depending on who you are and what your relationship to children is. But I would say keeping in mind that seriousness and sort of rejecting that societal pressure that to think about childhood as a sort of foolish or immature time.
And I think your life is an example of how we can do that because you're keeping both sides of your brain vital and engaged through your poetry and your work as a pediatrician. So I just want to thank you for your time with us today. You've been so generous with your thinking and your presentation. So we just give you a great clap and shout out. And if you are willing, please share with us that poem once again.
Thank you, Selena. Would you like me to just read it again?
Absolutely.
Okay. And it will be published in a journal called The Boiler a little bit later this year, so you can keep an eye out for it there. It's not currently online, but I'll read it one more time.
Thanks.
The forest fire of family trees. The problem is we don't know that many ways of doing things. For instance, neither of us can fry an egg without public radio chattering in our ears. And there are worse blueprints for a home, like what my grandfather taught my uncle. We think we know people until we see the way they eat a banana, totally unlike how we peel and devour the fruit. Only instead of eating a banana, it's something way bigger, like loving another person. As the snowflakes get thicker, I hear myself say exactly what my mother would say when faced with the same situation, and I say it in her voice. It's not that I'm ashamed to share all my DNA and most of my life with these two people. It's just that I worry. It's not easy to recognize the odor of toxins you release day after day, which, when rearranged, spells door. You cross the threshold and think it's just the cologne of the world, not the smoke in your blood, not grass burning from the little fires ignited by your feet.
So beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Selena, for facilitating this.
Absolutely. Thank you all for being here today and celebrating philanthropy and the work that we get to collectively participate in our community to make it better. Thanks for your support, and that's it.